Welcome to Ham Radio Perspectives. I'm Quinn, Kilowatt 8 Queen Sugar.
And I am Tom, WA9 Tango Delta Delta.
Tom, you know, ham radio has been around about 100 years, and over most of that time, it grew in part because of print media, even though hamming itself was basically an electronic medium. Print media were crucial, right?
That's correct. In the beginning of the early 1900s, the wireless radio was pretty much controlled by corporations and companies that were engaged in either marine or commercial telegraph services until a few, shall we call them rebels, decided to dig into the process, circuits, and the way the whole thing operated, and started publishing material that described this, again, the circuits and the procedures.
Right. So let's take a look at how print media in particularly grew or nurtured ham radio. It's a fascinating story with a lot of dimensions that take us into the present times, how print media grew ham radio. I'd like to say, and this is the academic part of me, you know, the professor, that there are four aspects of this. The print media fostered, first of all, community. You can't have ham radio without a community of ham. Second, an identity. What does it mean to be a ham? Third is a knowledge base, the information, the things that people were learning and passing along to one another, both on the air and in print media. And then finally, an imagination. Behind ham radio, there's always an imagination as to what it is and what it can do for us. So print media fostered all four of those. The type of resources we're going to look at in this broadcast are, first of all, periodicals, the general ones, the ham radio specific ones. We'll look at reference works, call books, catalogs, kit resources, there's an interesting one, and fiction, of course, which has always been important, but especially in the earlier days of ham radio. Now, in later broadcasts, we'll pick up some of these in more depth and talk about how important they are to the hobby. But for now, we're going to give an overview about the significance of print media, starting with general periodicals. And Tom, you're the expert on this. What's this all about?
Okay, the gentleman you see intently reading down on the left is Hugo Gernsback. He was a pioneer in amateur radio. He was also a futurist, an editor, a publisher, and an inventor. And in 1908, he produced what is the first magazine of radio and electronics worldwide, called the Modern Electronics. And given the dubious illustration on the front cover of it, it's kind of interesting to see what they were getting into. But he led the way in pioneering magazines, periodicals in radio and electronics. In 1910 or so, the American public was pretty much fascinated with modern radio. In 1919, he published his first specific amateur radio news, or radio amateur news. And it was, at this time, there was actually 10,000 amateur radio operators in the United States. And eventually this name of the publication was changed to just radio news when broadcast radio became more popular.
Yeah, so you had to get that radio amateur in there. And this is really fascinating. So right away, early in the hobby, you get this magazine coming out, which people are looking at and reading. What about this one?
Radiocraft, that's also another Gernsback publication. He actually had 60 different publications. About 30% of them were dedicated to radio and electronics. The others were on various other subjects. But he continued until sometime in about 1974 with publishing radio-oriented materials.
Amazing. And this is one of his too, short-wave craft or not?
Indeed it is. This is another Hugo Gernsback publication. This one is dedicated more to just the shortwave listener and how to build shortwave regenerative radios, 3-tube Nutridynes, and all that good stuff that was in the basis of radio at the time.
Man, he was active. So here we get into something a little more recent that I can remember, Electronics Illustrated.
I remember too. I read it a few times. Wasn't one of my normal pick up every month publications, but it had a few of the basic amateur construction projects in it, circuits, and was a stepping stone for me in order to get into the hobby.
Yeah, I think I built some things from it, but I can't remember what. Now, when we go to the next one here, Popular Electronics, I've got to tell you, Tom, this thing had tremendous impact on me. I know that I built stuff that was in there. I read it. I had a subscription for a while, but even before that, I would go to the library and borrow them as a kid and take them home and read them from cover to cover. And the ads were just as important. And this thing went till 82, and it had 409,000 paid subscribers in 1982. Phenomenally popular. And one of the things that was really popular for me was Herb Breyer's column called Across the Ham Bands. And he was not only a ham columnist, but he was very influential in the hobby. He wrote for other magazines as well. This Across the Ham Bands was interesting for me as a kid because it had this other aspect to it where he called it news and views. You can see these columns in the bigger column he had called News and Views, where he would actually talk about what different hams were doing. And so on this one here, we see, for example, Bill Bross, WN5 IBM in Tulsa, does his electron agitating on 40 meters. Bill's homebrew transmitter and Drake 2B receiver, I own one of those puppies, have put 19 states from coast to coast in his logbook. His antenna is 42 feet high, and so on. Well, I would get Popular Electronics specifically to read Herb Breyer's columns and these little blurbs he had at the end about different hams. And I would imagine myself being one of them and working all of these stations like they were and finding out what rigs they used, because those must have been good rigs. And after a while, he had this column you can see I put in the bottom here, Among the Novice Hams. And it was a combination of technical information for new hams and also news about what other hams were doing. So for me, this was tremendously influential, and I really grooved on it.
And the other one here is Boy's Life. I got that as a regular subscription as being a Boy Scout, and it had an occasional article on amateur radio. The Boy Scouts were very good at promoting ham radio. I had the radio merit badge, the Morse code merit badge, and it was a stepping stone for me. They didn't often, but they rarely and not often had an article about ham radio in it, but it was just another adjunct to my toolkit of radio information.
Yeah, I remember it too. And they had more stuff on radio than just ham radio, but shortwave and other things, because radio is big for kids. So let's look at some ham-specific periodicals now, starting, of course, with QST, the publication of the ARRL, or American Radio Relay League. Started in 1915 to the present. There was a little bit of a hiatus for it during World War I, when radio was more or less shut down because of concerns about the enemy using radio. But very, very influential magazine still is. Here's a present-day version of it, circulation 150,000 plus. It's interesting that even that doesn't match something like Popular Electronics in its heyday decades ago. It covers many things. It's technical stuff. Yeah, the contents include product reviews, new products. That's a very important part of the magazine that a lot of people like to read. And, of course, it includes on all of these specialized columns that they have on what's going on with DX, information about different events. The Hamfest calendar, I used to always love to read the Hamfest calendar a month in advance so I'd know where the Hamfests were and I could get off to them. Of course, this is before you can easily find out online. The ads were quite popular at the end of the magazine, too. They had all these different columns about different aspects of the hobby, trying to cover the full gamut. Still very, very popular. And the ARRL more recently started On the Air magazine, which you can get in print as an alternative to QST, or you can view them both in the digital format as well. So this is On the Air with some different columns for beginners. It's interesting that the QST has always struggled with having enough material for newcomers to get them to subscribe, to join the ARRL, and also for people who've been in the hobby for some length of time. And so they've got this magazine now for folks that are new to the hobby to try to hang on to them. CQ Magazine, another popular one. I subscribed to it for years. 1945, still going. In fact, I believe I built my first transmitter, a one-tube transmitter, from an article in CQ. I haven't been able to find it, but it was called something like the little peanut whistle, a one-tube transmitter that I built, and I had a couple, I think I had 2 crystals for 40-meter CW. So CQ has been around a long time. Of course, they're experts on the DX scene, and they've always had the DX contests and DX rankings and so forth. Here's a modern day look at it. We get into 73 magazine, which has been very popular in its day. It only went until 2003. It was kind of a one-person magazine in the sense that a guy that really ran it and pushed it and made it happen, because he was kind of a cantankerous, very opinionated guy by the name of Wayne Green.
Wayne Green.
Oh, Wayne Green, what a character. And here's part of one of his columns where he's talking about whether or not hams should get interested in the afterlife and communicating with people in the afterlife. He would take on all of these things that he got interested in and run with them. He was big in UFOs and friends with Art Bell and the like. Here he is with his column, Never Say Die, based partly on his call letters, W2NSD. Never Say Die. His editorials are always interesting. Quite a guy. He was at war sometimes with the ARRL, or at least skirmishes, battles, and with his opinions, and he didn't like everything that the ARRL would do, so they would go back and forth on various things. But it showed through his magazine, too, how important it's been to have leaders, personalities in the hobby. And with him, with a magazine like that and his personality, speaking at Hamfest, he was quite a guy. Ham Radio Magazine, another ham radio specific one from 67 to 1990. It eventually folded into CQ Magazine. I subscribed to it for a while too. And they also published Ham Radio Horizons for a bit, which was aimed at newer hams. Again, like QST, trying to come up with a magazine that would be attractive for newcomers. Now let's get into another whole area of print media, helping to develop the hobby, growing the hobby, starting with radio, the miracle. Go for it, Tom.
Yeah, radio, the miracle of the 20th century. I'm in the wrong century already. This was another early publication about 1910 that introduced the public to what was eventually called radio, previously called wireless telegraphy. And I don't know the circulation. I don't even know the publisher of this, but I have seen some excerpts from it, and it's a quite interesting basic description of radio as they knew it at the time. Radio Amateur's Call Book. I actually have
handbook.
This one. Handbook.
Yeah.
What did I? Yeah. Well, you can build anything out of that handbook. Everything: receivers, antenna systems, tuners, transmitters, everything from one-tube regenerative receivers to one-tube transmitters and kilowatt amplifiers. They had it all. The book was about 432 pages thick. It had tube charts in the back. It had every reference you could possibly need as an amateur radio operator.
And it was a spectacular publication that the ARRL put all of this information in one place and sold it at a reasonable amount. And it took off. I mean, amateurs everywhere bought these things. I remember as a kid saving up enough money with a paper route in order to go buy a copy of this thing so that I had a really good reference book.
It was encyclopedic.
There you go, encyclopedic.
Encyclopedic. Well, thank you, Professor.
Yeah, you're getting into the Latin version of it there, you rascal, or Greek. Okay, so here we go with a tube manual.
It's also RCA receiving tube manual. They also had a transmitting tube manual. This had every description of every tube that RCA made. It gave you diagrams, pin layouts, screen, grid, filament layouts. If you had anything to do with receiving tubes, transmitting tubes, this was the book to have.
This was it. Yeah, the Bible.
This was it. Ham
And
radio license manual. I never used it. How about you, Quinn?
I never did either, but it was very popular and continues to be popular, and various organizations put out the license manuals. I think with newcomers in the hobby in particular that didn't have access to good libraries and other resources, so they could just order a book like this and have it for their study, it was really important.
Right. And now pretty much all the license material is online. Just go on and search for it, and you can get the pool of questions, answers, and even self-help tests to prove that you can pass the test. Boy's first book of radio and electronics. I had this book as a kid. I built my first crystal set out of that, and it was an amazing book. It was very simple, geared for those generally in the 10 to 11, 12-year-old range. I burned my fingers a few times on the first few soldering projects. They didn't tell you about safety back then, but it was a very good introduction to the radio and electronics hobby.
Interesting to know how many of those they sold.
It would be interesting to know. This is the second book. Alfred Morgan also was an amateur radio operator. I do not know his call, but both books put together gave you a real good fundamental background and basis to grow on.
I had a different book which I got in middle school that the teacher gave those of us in a ham club, or I know it was just an electronics club, and I can't remember what the book was. I remember a blue cover, and I devoured that thing to find out. It was a great reference. And then at the end of the school year, I didn't return it because I wanted to keep it.
Wait till you get a letter for the fine on that one.
Oh yeah. Okay, let's get into call books.
Call books. This is a 1920 edition of the amateur radio stations of the United States. It was a precursor to what became known as the call book. There were 10,000 stations in 1920. And each of them was listed in there in the telephone book style by call district and call sign. It gave the operator's name, address, and his license class. And these things were absolutely essential if you were going to QSL somebody that you had a QSO with, because if you didn't get their address correct over CW, their call was listed in there, and you got their address to send the QSL card to. These things, again, were like a telephone book. This is the 1974 edition, and I believe there was somewhere in the neighborhood of 700,000 calls listed in that call book.
And Tom, I'd like to say that they functioned not only to get that information to you, but they functioned in a symbolic way to give you a sense of membership. So when you were listed in there, you were part of the hobby. You were part of the community.
You were somebody.
You were somebody. And it was so neat to be able to go in and look up your call along with everybody else's calls, and to know that you were a true bona fide licensed member of the hobby. Very important.
The license hanging on your wall meant nothing until you were listed in the call book.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go on to kit resources. Now, this is interesting because we don't often think about how important printed kit material was for our development in the hobby, but it really was. And of course, Heathkit, number one. Wow, I still remember my first Heathkit kit. It was an SWR meter, and it was not only getting that kit and working on it, but it was going through that manual, how the equipment supposedly worked, and learning what? Schematics.
Yeah, Heathkit was primarily concerned with teaching electronic literacy. To put together one of their kits, you did not need to know anything about electronics. If you started on page 1, step 1, and they had a little box for checking off if that step was completed, by the time you got done, you had a very good basic understanding of electronics, schematics, how to read resistor codes, what a capacitor was, and just a great resource on how to get into electronics and build your own equipment.
Absolutely.
They started out after World War II putting together kits from leftover electronic components from World War II, and built themselves up into quite a little empire.
And it's hard to underestimate, I think, Tom, how important it was for those of us who got these kits to build them and then actually have them work. Or if they didn't work, to have a ham friend, an Elmer, as mentor, as they say, come over and help us get them working. But there was a sense of accomplishment in putting these kits together, even though they were relatively simple, as long as you could follow the pages.
Correct. And my first transmitter was a Heathkit DX40. 75 watts input, crystal controlled, CW and AM. Now I bought it used, it was already assembled, but when I had to do any troubleshooting, the manual that came with it was an absolute vital resource, as being able to trace out the problem, which was another good lesson in literacy.
Absolutely.
Radio Shack started in, I can't read the date on that, 1934, I believe. Yes, this is the Radio Shack that you remember selling cell phones and having the battery giveaway. They actually started out as a amateur radio equipment supplier in Boston, Massachusetts, and later grew to the entity that everybody knows of currently. I don't know if they're still in business or not. Some are, yeah. I've seen a few.
Now they did kits, right?
They did some kits, but the kits weren't amateur radio equipment. They were simpler kits like your walkie-talkies, crystal radios,
right,
AM radio, educational kits. But they were a distributor for general amateur radio equipment.
Exactly. So what we're looking at here now is some catalogs. I think I skipped a slide or something in here, but so we're in the catalogs now. And here's the Amateur Electronics Supply catalog. For me, growing up in Chicago and having Amateur Electronics Supply with a store in Chicago, but then their main store in Milwaukee. So if I get somebody to drive me up there and look in their store, it was terrific. But I want to mention something about their catalog back in the old days that's really important for the hobby. And that is that they included with their catalog a couple of pages listing all of their current used equipment and prices, if you can imagine that, in the catalogs. Today, of course, it's not timely enough for today, but back then that was really important. And I used to go through that list of used equipment and what the prices were and imagine how much I could earn. And if I could earn enough to get something in their catalog, because most of the new stuff I would never be able to afford. The Heathkit catalog. Wow, Tom.
Right. This was like the Sears Christmas catalog whenever that came in. It had everything in there. And I had a lot of Heathkit equipment, some of which is I built, the old Hot Water 100, an SP 201. There's a lot of equipment in there that I burned my fingers on putting together, but I also learned a lot. They had everything in there from electronic organs to CB radios to
stereo.
You name it. They were just a tremendous resource. Allied Radio, 1938. They were a company out of Chicago. I remember going there about 1962. My dad drove me there. I was building a wireless microphone, if you remember, that used to bug the AM radios with. I went in there at about 12 years old, and I was quite proud of myself that I was able to order a 0.002 capacitator in order for me to build my crystal oscillator using a Faraday coil. I had the knowledge, I just didn't have the pronunciation, but they are still in existence, as a matter of fact. They were bought out by, I believe it was Tandy, the same company that owned Radio Shack.
I used to go through that catalog, that Allied catalog, and look at all the night kits that were for ham radio, like these two right here, the T60 transmitter and the R55A 5-band receiver. And you look at these things in there, I would read every word in that catalog, and I would covet having one of these things and imagine myself getting one. Of course, these were night, K-N-I-G-H-T, night kits. And now not everything in the catalog was kits. Most of it was not, but they're night kits. were enchanting.
Night kits. Yes, I have that on the picture on the left. That's a Night T60 transmitter. And
That's
I've
right.
still
You
got
bought
one.
one of those.
I've got one, and it still works.
Oh, it works just as poorly as it did to begin with.
I
Chirping
had a
up and
T.
down the band.
I also had the big brother to that, the T150, but
We'll
somehow
talk
everything.
about that later when we talk
Okay,
about
okay.
all-time bad rigs.
I'm
We're going to
sorry.
do a show on all-time bad rigs, and I want to put the T150 in there, buddy.
Okay. Hey, you had one of these too, the C100 walkie-talkie.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I got stories to tell about that too, but we'll wait till later.
Yeah, we'll do that under our pranks. We're going to do a show on pranks. I got this. This was one of my early kits. Before I got into ham kits in particular, the walkie-talkie. And if you look on the bottom of this page, you'll see it shows them doing things. And of course, they wanted to get kids. So one of the images down there is a kid on a bicycle, and he's got his walkie-talkie, and he's talking who knows where. And then you got this other guy fishing. Yeah, I'm going to go fishing down at the local pond where you never catch any fish, maybe carp. But you got that C100, and you could talk with the world, even if there was nobody else on.
As long as the world was only 2 blocks away.
Yeah, or a block for that matter. Although I have to admit, I attached some other illegal antennas to the top of that thing to get a little bit further.
Yeah, but we'll cover that in pranks.
We will. Lafayette Radio, big time.
Lafayette Radio was another company that started back in the 1930s out of New York. Actually, they were the first American distributor of Trio radio products, which
Trio
were specifically
Kenwood.
Trio Kenwood. They were specifically aimed at the amateur market. They were branded with their own Lafayette brand, but they were actually imported and manufactured by Trio Kenwood.
Isn't that amazing? I remember I had a Lafayette receiver one time, not a kit, and it was not super cheap. It was kind of pricey. The receiver had almost no sensitivity. It was terrible, no matter how good an antenna I put on it. So I peddled it at some ham fest to some poor soul. There's a look at the Lafayette page. Isn't that spectacular? Look at all that old equipment. Man, oh man.
You can just smell the ozone.
Yeah, I love the prices too. $10 for a transmitter, whatever. Okay, well, then we get into the current, of course, ham radio outlet. And here's Swan had a catalog. 1972, I bought a Swan 500C. I look at that. I had forgotten that they had a whole catalog of their equipment, but catalogs were so important, paper catalogs to send out to hams back then. And here is the Sears catalog. Yes, indeed, friends in radio land, the Sears Roebuck catalog. Sears sold ham equipment, and here are new national receivers. Oh boy, I owned a couple of national receivers in my day too. But you look at this, the top one, if you can read that, $148 or $147.50. You could say 50 cents for the national NC 200 back then. You own one of those, don't you?
I've got a NCX 100, I believe. It's not pictured here, but that was a war surplus receiver. But you look at $148 or $147.50 back in whatever year that was that you've got that page from. But you've got to consider that was about $1,200 in today's dollars. You had to peddle a lot of papers in order to buy one of those.
Yeah. But again, the Sears Roebuck catalog. And now let's get into fiction for a little bit before we wrap it up. Fiction's always been important because, as I say, ham radio is imagination. We're a community of imagination talking about what's possible with our equipment.
Yeah, Tom Swift and the wireless message. These were great incubators for thinking along the lines of creativity and innovation. Some of the stuff at the time it was written about didn't exist, but through the message and the medium, people started playing around with the idea and actually developed a lot of the things that these old books had predicted.
Yeah, one of the great literary critics of the 20th century said that all fiction has to do with salvation. Somebody's got to be saved from something. If they're not saved, it's a tragedy. But in fact, with a lot of these fiction stories aimed at kids. They were all about saving the world from crime or something else.
Right, and Radio Boys at the Sending Station, some book in a similar vein, innovation and getting the youth involved in radio.
Yeah, oh man, this is just great stuff.
And radio girls, in order to be politically correct back then, we even got the girls involved.
You know,
And look at that! Look at that antenna. Is that a great antenna or what? I'd love to have one of those.
It's fantastic. It's got a rhombic up there. So let's go back a page,
Right.
Tom. I was going to comment on these guys. Look at the way they're dressed. It's spectacular. They get
right, and they were dressed down in that day. Look at the microphone. The guys look like he's talking into a funnel.
Power, man, power.
It's yeah, power.
Partly about power. And look at these were women, not just girls, but true women.
Indeed. Look like they're sitting in the county park by the lake. Archie's Ham Radio Adventures. A bit of discussion on this one. We finally determined that it was actually published by the ARRL. But I do still believe that the Radio Shack had something to do with it also. So they might have been a co-sponsor of it.
Archie's Ham Radio Adventure. And you look at those little images there, the adventures. This was designed in part, Tom, to get kids interested in ham radio.
Indeed it was. And the ARRL is always interested in getting kids involved in amateur radio because, hey, that's where we grew up from.
You got to have new people coming in.
Carl and Jerry. Carl and Jerry was a regular feature in Popular Electronics that featured two high school buddies that with various hijinks involving electronics. They finally published 2 complete volumes of the collective stories.
Isn't it something else? So the point here is that print media were crucially important in the development of the hobby. Community, a sense of participation with others through these media. Identity, what it meant to be a ham. Knowledge, so much of the knowledge, the technical knowledge, the operating knowledge, the procedures, all of it. And of course, the imagination from the stories about ham radio, and even those little illustrations in the catalogs. So print media were very, very important for the development of the hobby, Tom. And I was so delighted to grow up at a time when I could get some of these things, often just at the library because I couldn't afford them. But it was important.
Absolutely. And without those publications, neither one of us had probably been in amateur radio.
Absolutely. So everybody, thanks for watching. And please, if you would, subscribe to the channel. As I said, we got a lot more stuff coming up. We're going to do a show on pranks. We're going to do some shows on clunker rigs. You won't want to miss these things. And if you like what we're doing, give us a thumbs up, or you don't, give us a thumbs down, and put some comments down below. And I bet some of you have thoughts or ideas beyond what we've covered in this brief overview of the importance of print for growing ham radio. So thanks so much. We'll talk again with you very soon on the ham bands. This is Quinn, K8QS, saying 7-3.
And Tom, WA9 Tango, Delta Delta, 7-3s, and have a good day.
Ciao.